Good morning, everyone. Seems as this is working. My name is Barry Kayton. I'm from Cape Town, South Africa. Moved to the Bay Area in November 2013. And I'm going to be talking very briefly about the future of text in the context of learning and development. I'm an instructional designer by background, and I have an online learning company. Thank you very much. And of course, we're going to talk about the future of text. So the first thing I'm going to do is take you back to the past. Learning pretext. In Plato's Academy, you may recall the dialogue with Phaedrus, in which there was a great suspicion of text and reading because it replaced memory with reminding, as Plato said. And what was really happening in that time was Socratic dialogue, Socratic learning, person to person, through dialogue rather than lecturing. And along came Gutenberg a few hundred years later and invented the printing press, which we all take as a great move forward. And of course it was, but there's a dark side to the printing press, and that is that it changes the way we learn. Instead of Socratic practice, you get a monologue from an author going on for hundreds and hundreds of pages with very limited opportunities to interact with the text. And so what we get is marginalia. Author and reader communicating, and sometimes if you're sharing a book via a library, you've got reader and reader communication on the pages of the book. And of course nowadays with the apps that we're using like iBooks and Kindle and so on, there's the opportunity to do something like marginalia, highlighting text, adding your own notes, and many people have thought, we can do all sorts of things with this by introducing collaboration, which is why we're here today. But what I want to talk about is the idea that form follows function. So we have a beer mug, and it can capture beer. Of course, it's beer, not water. And we have a pitcher that's optimized for pouring beer. Now, the two things can hold beer, but that one works if you want to pour it, and this one works if you want to hold it. The question I want to ask is conventional text optimized for capturing or for transferring knowledge, skills, attitude, mindset, values, and so on? And my contention is that conventional text is optimized only for capturing and is actually appalling for learning, unless, like 99.9% of the people in this room, you find learning easy. Most people in the world find learning from text very, very difficult. Now, maybe that's a contentious argument, but I come from South Africa, where the dropout rate in high schools is abominable. For every 100,000 students that enter school in grade 1, a very small fraction actually get through high school, and a very much smaller fraction manage to get into tertiary education for many reasons. But for the vast majority of people, conventional learning via text does not work. The central problem of text is information centricity, which leads to passive learning, which is ineffective. That's my hypothesis. How much of what is captured in text is actually transferred to the reader in the process of reading a text? And the key challenge of learning is to guide the reader, the learner, to focus on something very specific and absorb that in some way through the process of cognition. And when this is effective, it's an active learning process in which you interact with the ideas in some way, which again is why we're here. How do we get text to do this for us? And if we're talking about evaluating learning, we can look at a model like the Kirkpatrick-Phillips model, which looks at the reaction or satisfaction that a user gets out of a learning process, the learning that happens, the confidence that they get from that process, and the impact on their behavior, which could take many forms, and finally the results that you get either in a business context or in a social context. So the question is, what are the implications for the future of text? How do we bring Socratic principles to text? And what exactly are those principles? I'm going to take you through 5 very quickly. First of all, a conversational modality, because dialogue engages the mind in a way that lectures do not, or the monologue of a text. The second principle is that if we use coaching questions, questions drive our thinking, and thinking drives our behavior. So if we want people to change their behavior, whether we want them to be critical thinkers, creative thinkers, if we want them to learn some kind of knowledge, we have to change the way they think. And to do that, you need coaching questions that transfer the process of thinking from the reader, or from the author, from the lecturer, over to the audience, to the readers, to the learners. And it's all about being user-centric in nature, starting with something of interest to the learner. If you think about this chimp, she's motivated to get the termites out of the termite mound, and so that drives her learning process. Similarly, if you create a learning process in which you figure out what the termite is in that particular context, what is the reader trying to do by reading the text, and you design a conversation around that thing, the termite, which the thing to think about, then you get much better learning. And if you structure that conversation through a mental model of some kind that takes people systematically through a series of questions structured around a mental model, you get very effective learning. An example of this would be a SWOT analysis. Instead of simply telling people how to do one, you take them systematically through a series of questions structured according to the mental model of a SWOT analysis. And those questions help them to apply the SWOT analysis immediately rather than just learning about it. Two more principles. The first is self-reflection. You drive self-reflection through a questioning process. And the second one is self-expression. If you give people the opportunity to express their ideas rather than just feeding them content, that engages the mind. And it's core to being human. This is what we've been doing for thousands of years, expressing ourselves in one way or another. But it all comes down to Confucius, an ancient truth. Tell me and I forget things, show me and I remember. But if you involve me, I understand. So the question is, how can we make text involve the reader? For my very earliest implementation of this, the software that my team has developed, Cognition, originally was a mind map in which you would take a term out of a text. In this case, the term is text. And the software would generate a whole bunch of questions for you to help you think about that thing, the thing you want to think about, the termite in this case. But that was 5 years ago. And we've now transitioned to a system which delivers a script of questions along with conventional text. And it's not questions about the text, it's a script of questions based on a mental model of some kind. In this case, my coach here is asking me who am I having a conflict with at the moment. I say John. She then asks me what the problem is. How would I describe the conflict with John? I say, well, John's missing deadlines, he's driving everybody crazy, he's costing us a fortune, and so on. I'm reflecting on my personal context, the problem I'm having with John, and I'm self-expressing what that is. And then the coach asks another question: how would John describe this conflict? So the script of questions is text, but it's text in a very unusual way. It's text that brings Socratic principles to the learning process, but we can combine it with conventional text and video and all sorts of other things. And that's basically our contribution to this process. We were hugely influenced by Doug Engelbart, and we may not be using a system that's very close to what he had in mind, but we now have clients in 37 countries using the system for all sorts of amazing things. Be happy to take your questions and begin a dialogue.
In fact, first of all, I love the orientation that you're describing, and in fact, the question I almost asked Sam was about this tension between text as a container versus as part of a dialogue, as a medium of a dialogue. So my question is, and my great curiosity about communication in general is how, if you've given any thought to how you know that the interaction, the dialogue, the question, answer, the coaching, whatever that is, how that interaction is successful moment by moment. How does one, how can you assess that the coaching question has been understood or misunderstood? And kind of assuming that, yeah, it's probably misunderstood. What, so
Sure. So we obviously track everything the user's doing. So in a script of questions, let's say it's 20 questions long, the system tracks how many words the user is writing in response to the questions. And what we find is that some questions encourage a huge response, some questions encourage a smaller response. But most of the feedback we get is anecdotal. We've had people stand in front of an audience in tears saying that this is like having a therapist 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it's completely changed their lives. That's a particular program on our system. One of the things I didn't mention is that the platform is there, but we have programs on top of the platform. And that particular program was designed for students who are struggling with fears of failure and stress and so on. And the coaching questions were designed to help them think through those problems and improve their capability to manage stress. So the feedback is anecdotal. It's also metric-based to see how people respond. And one more point, we often ask users to share insights. What have you learned through this particular session that you can share with other people, that you want to share with other people? And if you look at the insights, on one program, about 50% of the users shared insights, and of those, about 37%, I think it was, used words like I realized, I discovered, and so on. Words that indicate some sort of state change that was happening. Yeah.
Okay. Very good, thanks.
Sure.
It occurs to me, or it occurred to me, that if teachers really used Socratic methods, they could probably teach 30 children at a time, because the real work is being done by the children. Can you elaborate on the magic of Socrates that you have discovered?
Sure. I don't know how much time I have, but the trajectory of my career was determined by a company that used advertising to teach people to read. If you think about it, even if you're an adult who's unable to read, you can still recognize Coca-Cola, Ford, Toyota, all the brands that companies spend millions of dollars on, making sure we remember them. So you have an adult illiterate who feels ashamed of the fact that he or she cannot read, being presented with a series of pictures of products and logos. And the realization they have is, I can read. This is not as hard as I thought. And we use the same kind of principles in our system. What does the user already know that is going to accelerate the learning process? And so if you start with something of importance to each person and get them to think about that thing, it allows them to build new knowledge on something that's already not only cognitively familiar to them, but also emotionally resonant to them as well. As opposed to a lecturer who starts with his or her own example, of which maybe half the audience cannot relate. And so I totally agree. The Socratic method in a classroom is certainly going to be very helpful, particularly if you ask each person to think about something that's important to them.
I'm interested in what your approach is best used for, and where there are limitations, or where you recommend it, where it's not as good as others.
Sure. We veer away from using our system to teach other systems, like the use of software. But we anticipated that people would use the system for things that we had no idea that they would. Our biggest partner focuses on continuous improvement, training in factories, which is all about changing the way people think about their work, their practices. It's about changing people's behavior in order to make a factory more productive.
Thank you very, very much.
Sure. Thank you.